Today's presentation is a taxonomy of use, developing a provenance thesaurus for libraries. And your presenters are Andrew Lundeen and Tad Bomer. With that, I will hand it over.
Okay, go ahead and get my slideshow shared here. There we go.
Good morning, everybody. In the course of my work as curator and cataloger of rare books at MSU, one of the few things I most enjoy is uncovering the stories tied to our copy of a book, using clues left behind by former owners, by readers, and by others who have read, used, or otherwise handled the item, copy-specific features. A few years ago, while browsing our vault looking for something else entirely, as it always goes, I came across a copy of a 1610 London edition of The Mirror for Magistrates, a collection of poems by various authors telling of the lives and tragic downfalls of a number of historical figures. A portion of the text is even known to have inspired Shakespeare's King Lear. Because we have not had a dedicated cataloger of rare books at MSU until quite recently, I was not surprised to see that the catalog record was minimal, and so I took the book back to my desk for recataloguing. I could tell that the inscription on the title page was in an early hand, and the name itself caught my attention. Unton Deering. What an odd name, I thought, but something about Unton rang a bell for me. Nearly a dozen years ago, I visited the National Portrait Gallery in London, and the picture that most impressed me was one of the earliest known likenesses of a non-royal individual. This was a portrait of Sir Henry Unton from around 1596, with scenes from his life illustrated in cartoon panel style. His birth, his marriage, the birth of his children, a feast at his home, Wadley House near Oxford, and his funeral, all presided over, Godzilla style, by Sir Henry himself. Could I prove that the owner of this book was somehow connected to him? I began to research the Deering family and its connections via marriage to the Untons. To keep straight the scraps of evidence I turned up, I drew a family tree linking up the known figures. To make a long story short, I was able to prove that Lady Unton Deering, for lady she married a baronet, was the niece of Sir Henry Unton, and was named in his honor, possibly because he died around the time of her birth. In fact, one of Lady Unton's descendants gifted the portrait of Sir Henry to the nation, and so we have her partially to thank for its survival. I also learned that she was one of the first women to participate in a political campaign, stumping on behalf of her husband, Sir Edward, as he ran for Member of Parliament. Many of their love letters survive and have been published. Unton Deering had no authority record in OCLC, so I was able to exercise my recent NACO training to create one. I then had the great pleasure of adding her as a former owner in the Mark record, as others will be able to do should her ownership of other volumes be proven. I think that the story illustrates an important point, and that is that books tell stories in many different ways. Books can take us to new places, introduce us to all sorts of new characters, and teach us new things. But books are also physical artifacts, and they can speak to us through that physicality, through the markings, additions, and alterations left behind by printers, binders, readers, and owners. By examining these pieces of evidence, we can learn a lot about how a book was produced, sold, purchased, handled, interacted with, censored, loved, gifted, forgotten, and rediscovered. These copy-specific markings, these signs of provenance, or how a book came to be where it is and came to look the way that it looks now, can range from the obvious to the innocuous, but they add up to tell really fascinating tales if we know how to interpret them. And so for the past few years, the Murray and Hong Special Collections at MSU has been laying the groundwork to create a database of these copy-specific features in our own books. The back-end database infrastructure is still under construction, but one of the supporting authority files, a thesaurus of provenance terms to classify these features, is what we want to talk to you about today. Our hope is that you might find this thesaurus useful for provenance in your own collections, or at least that hearing about our process might be helpful for your own work. And now Andrew will talk a little more about the background of this project at MSU.
Thanks, Tad. And thanks everybody else for being here this morning. So like Tad said, I want to give a brief history of the Provenance project at MSU because I think it's important to understand where we are now in terms of the context of where we've been. So the project started informally way back in 2013. And data collection was originally very primitive. The scope of the project was not yet fully realized. Students were annotating by hand printouts from the catalog, just writing down any marks of provenance that they saw in a very uncontrolled fashion. And this is when I came onto the project, and very quickly we moved to electronic data collection. And at this stage, we knew that we wanted all of this provenance information to be compiled into a database. And so we had to exert some sort of authority control on the data that was being collected, right? In this first iteration of the project, we relied on the Provenance Evidence Thesaurus, which was created by the Rare Books and Manuscript section of the ACRL, RBMS, as it was one of the only controlled vocabularies out there for this sort of thing. And in these early years, everything was essentially going into one giant spreadsheet. Nothing was publicly browsable. We were also sort of figuring things out as we went, creating new policies and procedures as necessary. The project was then basically frozen for a few years as my role within the library grew and changed a bit. Then in 2019, we started up work on the project again, and this is when Tad came on board. And we decided that this time we would do things right. We would learn from some of the mistakes of the past. And so this is when we started building our own homegrown database infrastructure behind the scenes, as well as when we started creating our own authority file to classify provenance. Okay, but why create our own provenance thesaurus in the first place? There are a number of provenance-related vocabularies out there, including, of course, the RBMS provenance thesaurus that I just mentioned, but also including a number of other related RBMS vocabularies, such as the paper terms thesaurus or the thesaurus for binding terminology. Also, around the same time that we first started our project, there were other projects, other provenance projects that were springing up at other institutions. UPenn's Provenance Online project was one of the first. They were loading tons of provenance images onto a Flickr page, and they used Flickr's tagging system to assign identifiers to their provenance entries. The Book Traces project at the University of Virginia is another provenance project that started up around that time. And they detail in their white paper a limited provenance vocabulary that they derived from the RBMS thesaurus. Then, of course, there are a number of printed books and other publications that deal with provenance, and these use their own bodies of terminology. So you could say that the MSU Provenance Thesaurus is just one more entry in a long chain of existing provenance vocabularies. And of course, you'd be right. I'm reminded of this classic XKCD webcomic that says, how standards proliferate. Situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14? Ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah. Situation, now there are 15 competing standards. And I think there's an element of truth in that, right? But we're not saying that our thesaurus is necessarily the gold standard here, just that the existing vocabularies didn't really do everything we wanted them to. That is, they didn't work for our purposes. And I think it's actually easy to see why if you consider that these existing standards generally fall into one of three categories. So either they're not really controlled. And by that, I mean that they're more like dictionaries or glossaries that allow for potentially conflicting usages. That is, they're merely descriptive rather than prescriptive in the manner of an authority file. Or they're not really fully fledged thesauri with explanatory scope notes, relationships between terms, or support for synonyms or variant terminology. Or they are somewhat limited in their scope. And this is often because many of them are ultimately derived from a single source, the RBMS thesaurus. And the RBMS vocabulary, while it is more or less a fully fledged thesaurus, was designed for a different purpose than our thesaurus. It was designed to support rare book cataloging, specifically in MARC. So I think it might be useful here to talk briefly about how our provenance database is arranged in the back end. There are two basic types of records in the database. There are item level records. So these are for individual books in our collections. And these come with certain basic bibliographic metadata imported directly from our catalog: title, author, date of publication, that sort of thing. But then each of these item level records can have any number of observation level records attached to it. And these records are for the individual instances of provenance evidence that we observe in any particular book. So one record for a book plate by itself, a separate record for an ownership inscription penciled on the title page, and so on. And these observation level records are really the heart of the database. They have several different fields within them, and the classification field is the one that is controlled by the thesaurus. But I think the focus on these observation level records leads to one of the disconnects between our thesaurus and the RBMS thesaurus. Our database is provenance centric. The observation records take center stage, and everything else is sort of built around them. An observation record, or even an item record in our database, is not a catalog record, which is a more holistic treatment of a book. Our database is entirely centered around marks of provenance. And you can see how this disconnect manifests itself in the actual vocabularies when you start comparing sections from our current thesaurus to the RBMS thesaurus. There are whole areas in which the RBMS vocabulary is just lacking for our purposes. So here, for example, we have two snippets from our thesaurus, and you can see that for these areas, which are broadly speaking, things related to the binding and some other types of physical alterations, and then various types of decorative markings, the RBMS thesaurus just doesn't really have matching terms. And to be clear, some of these missing concepts do appear in other RBMS vocabularies, but they aren't unified in an assignable way within the provenance thesaurus. So in many cases, we had to generate these terms or pull them together from various competing sources. So very generally, I like to say that we came at this approach from three different directions. What you might call a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, and then what I'm going to refer to as a sideways or side-to-side approach. And I don't think any of this is groundbreaking, of course, but I am going to run through these three approaches just very quickly so that we can see how they manifested themselves in our thesaurus. So bottom up first. At the end of the day, our goal for this thesaurus is to be applicable to the work of describing our collections, right? Of creating this database of provenance observations in our books. So of course it makes sense to start with the books, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at hundreds of individual books in our collections, ranging from incunabula to modern books, Western books, as well as books published outside of Europe or the Americas. And we also looked at examples from other collections outside of MSU as well. And we tried to describe and categorize the copy-specific features that we saw. And at this stage, that essentially boiled down to just listing everything that we saw and not worrying too much about the exact correct terms for things, but just capturing as many different examples as we could. And then we started simplifying, grouping like with like, and building up higher level categories from the commonalities that we saw. So, for example, we see a lot of drawings in books, doodles, pictures, illustrations, whatever you want to call them. And sometimes they're related to the book, and other times they are true doodles. But in either case, they have some degree of artistry, right? They're ornamental. We also have a few examples of foredge paintings in our collections. And these are fantastic, beautiful things when you come across them. But we had to ask ourselves, what is the difference really between pencil doodles, for example, and a foredge painting? The quality of the artistry, sure, and the medium, maybe the intent as well, right? Done out of boredom versus a desire to add some artistic value to the book. But on one axis, at least, they are essentially the same thing. Both are artistic representations that adorn a book. Both are decorative markings added after issue. They exist on a spectrum, and the difference between them is just a matter of degree or detail. So then we asked ourselves, well, okay, can we connect these examples to anything else that we see in our books? Sometimes we see other markings on foredges. For example, we occasionally see colored edges, books that have had coloring applied to their head, tail, or foredge. And again, you have to ask yourself, okay, what's the difference between these examples and foredge paintings? Both are just pigments or dyes applied to the edges of a book for decorative purposes, right? And of course, color could be applied elsewhere in a book too, not just the edges. Someone could have colored in existing woodcuts or printed illustrations and so on and so on. And so you start connecting the things that you're seeing, grouping them into categories by, I guess you could say, their essential qualities. And pretty soon you've created a category called decorative markings, built from the ground up, unifying multiple different observations by their similarities. And of course, top down is just the reverse of this. You start from the broadest categories in logical space and try to fill them in with specific examples. We very well could have said, well, markings are one way that a book could bear provenance evidence. What are some examples of markings? One way to mark up a book would be to write something in it, to annotate it. That is to add some markings that carry semantic value, whether that's marginalia or a former owner's inscription or whatever. But then what about markings that aren't linguistic in nature? Well, you could have stray marks or remnants of environmental damage like water stains. But what about other intentional markings? Couldn't you take your marking tool, whatever it might be, and apply it to a book in ways that are just ornamental? And then what would some examples of that be? So ultimately, you can arrive at the same place no matter what direction you came from. And ideally, you're taking both of these approaches and meeting somewhere in the middle. And that's where a lot of the work happens and happened. But these two approaches weren't the only methods that we applied, because we weren't just operating in a vacuum, coining entirely new terminology out of thin air. As we saw, there are all of these existing vocabularies and all of these existing use cases that we had to wrestle with and reconcile. All of these terms that we're using have some historical and technical baggage to them, right? Their meanings are often layered and complicated, and they can change over time. If we were writing a dictionary, we could try to capture all of those various meanings and make them all valid. But an authority file has to be more prescriptive. Consistency is key. So you have to deal with all of these nuanced meanings somehow. And you end up dealing with nuance in one of two ways. One of those ways is by splitting one term into several, each of them capturing some part of the sense of the original. For example, this is what many of you might call a monogrammed binding. A monogram, right, is just a design that combines or superimposes two or more letters of a name, and they're often heavily stylized. And you can see that this book has got this repeating monogram on the four corners of the cover and on 5 of the spine compartments as well. And in the RBMS thesaurus, they've got a term for monogrammed bindings. Of course, that makes sense. But we looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, doesn't each of these concepts carry some meaning on its own? Couldn't each of these terms stand alone? Because we occasionally see monograms divorced from bindings, right? They can be stamped in ink on a page or even hand drawn somewhere else in a book. So we took the monograms portion of this term, the part that describes the content, and we made it separately assignable. And we took the bindings portion of this term and we made it separately assignable. And now, if you want to classify a monogrammed binding, you just assign both terms. The classification is the conjunction or intersection of these two terms. And if you want to add further nuance, you just add more terms. So in some sense, we're breaking down these complex terms into their atomic elements. And another way you can deal with nuance, and this is the less desirable way, is to smooth out some of the rough edges, right? That is, combine several different meanings into a single term. So a really simple example of that would be for our term relief stamps, which is a term that encompasses both embossed and debossed stamps. Now, technically, yes, there is a difference between embossing and debossing. One is a raised relief while the other is sunken. These two terms are very closely related, but they are not synonyms. Oops. Um, but we determined that for our purposes, this distinction wasn't really worth worrying about, at least not for just classifying evidence. And this can happen for a number of different reasons, by the way, not the least of which is the very practical question, what is the likelihood of misclassification? That is, if we left this distinction in place, do we think that our data entry folks would be able to cleanly, quickly, and reliably tell the difference in every case? Anyway, we ended up using both of these strategies, that is, sometimes splitting one term into many, sometimes combining terms. But I think what's important to take away here is that we didn't just ignore the ways that these terms were being used or ignore existing vocabularies. Just the opposite. We had to try and fold these existing terms and all of their baggage into our thesaurus. And so the resulting thesaurus currently weighs in at a little over 200 terms and counting. 99 of those are valid preferred terms, and the other 100 or so are non-preferred variants. So synonyms, variant spellings, foreign language terms, and so on. And one important thing to keep in mind, as we saw in the example of a monogrammed binding, is that these classifiers function sort of like tags in that you can assign multiple terms to a single observation. Sometimes provenance evidence is multifaceted and might be best classified by the combination of several different terms, some for form, some for content, and so on. And I love to throw around this number, which is sort of the upper limit on the total possible combinations of all of those 99 valid terms. So, and this is somewhat meaningless number, but in theory anyway, there are 633 octillion ways to classify something with this thesaurus. That's 633 billion. Of course, the vast majority of these combinations, although they are logically valid, will make no actual sense. That is, they won't correspond to any observation of provenance that does exist or could exist in reality. But hey, I relish any opportunity to use a 30-digit number in a presentation, so I had to get that in there. I'm not going to detail the entire thesaurus here. It is available online currently if you want to download the most up-to-date version as a PDF. I just have it loaded right now onto my library staff page at staff.lib.msu/edu/alundine. That is a temporary solution. The website for the provenance database is still under construction, but eventually the full thesaurus will live there. And since this is a living document, it will have version control, a change log, and the ability to submit feedback or suggest changes or additions as well. So watch that space. And okay, I'm going to pass it back to Tad now, who's going to show some additional real world examples of how we are applying this thesaurus to marks of provenance in our own collections.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think it would be helpful at this point to look at some examples of the thesaurus in action using images of items from MSU's Murray and Hong special collections. So here we have the title page of an 1833 work. It's got a good deal to note as far as copy-specific features go. Take 10 seconds or so to take a visual inventory of the marks of provenance you see here, just as a nice quick exercise. So this is how we would break down these terms using our thesaurus, rather using terms from our thesaurus. First of all, we see several occasions on the head and foredge of material damage or excisions, where portions of the leaf have been torn or broken away. The staining across the midsection of the page is classified as environmental markings. We don't know exactly the source of these markings. The name across the top of the page is that of the third president of the State Agricultural College, now MSU, Theophilus Capon Abbott. Knowing the history of Abbott's collection and how it came to be housed at the library, we are classifying this as an autograph or ownership inscription, as we conclude that it is in Abbott's hand. The inscription further down the page, though, by W. Cooley, Esquire, was almost certainly written here because the author of the work is not formally identified in print. So this is a bibliographic note. Finally, you can just see the circular relief stamp from one of the precursors of MSU towards the head of the leaf. So you get an idea here of how we break down each element present on a page, on the binding, or on another part of a book and look at the whole as the sum of its parts. Here we see a family portrait, children of the same parent. These are all examples of labels. They are unified in form, designed to be affixed via adhesion, but they serve distinct purposes and are worth being called out individually. In the upper left-hand corner, a binder's ticket specifically. This is a label for identifying the binder of a volume. A bookseller's label below that, and to the right, a book plate, just happens to be of Harry Houdini from our collections. All of these terms are closely related. They're siblings in our hierarchy, and that they are all designed to be affixed through adhesion. And this usually conveys some information about the book or its owners. But things aren't always so straightforward, as some pieces of evidence require multiple terms to describe accurately. Here we have the upper portion of the front free end paper in a 1548 work on natural science. A number of inscriptions provide a range of information here, but let's focus on the lower half of the image. Several things are going on here. First of all, we have an ownership inscription. What it says, essentially, is that the volume is part of a library that was housed at Madrid in 1749. 1749 we would naturally classify as a date, with the geographical location noted as well in the database. The name of the owner is mostly obliterated, unfortunately, but using the portions we can see, it is clear that he also wrote his name on the title page, where fortunately the inscription has not been obliterated. So whoever was trying to cross this out didn't cross out the other name, and so we can cross reference here. This is Jose Antonio Sara Quemada. Research continues into exactly who he was and what he did, but no matter what, we classify this as an autograph. Let's look again at that little volume that Andrew showed us earlier. Inside each board, below the paste down, and almost hidden by the gilt tooling, are stamped the name of the binder, the firm of Trout's Bosonnet of Paris, and the date of 1866. Since the binder is identified, this is what we would call a signed binding. You can see why provenance research really calls for a careful examination and a thorough eye. So taking the binding as a whole now, we will utilize the Thesaurus and employ several of the terms to describe it. We've got signed bindings, monograms, dates, shelf titles, as the title is lettered on the spine, as you can see, tooling, and gilding. In the mark record I created with the help of the dealer's description, for you mark fluent catalogers, this is a 563 local binding note. I describe all of these features, but of course there I go into a different kind of detail and discuss these various points of evidence in a more narrative fashion, elaborating when necessary and calling out specific individuals as appropriate. In contrast, the Thesaurus is intended as a means to identify and describe an observation of provenance in a succinct but accurate manner, and is not in and of itself meant for the longer form of description common in a catalog record. When utilized as a controlled vocabulary built into a database, however, it can combine with the other descriptive elements to paint a thorough and eminently searchable inventory of provenance data within a particular collection. I'll turn it back to Andrew now, and we will hear about how the terms directly informs our database and allows users to employ them as access points.
Thanks, Tad. So I want to end today with a look at the future of the provenance database and how the Thesaurus is going to be integrated into that database. I'm going to try to keep this from getting too technical, but I am happy to talk about this anytime at length outside of this presentation. Also, please keep in mind that this is still all a work in progress. So first of all, there will be a basic way to search across all the different database fields, a single line Google-like search box, if you will. If you searched for Ungendarian, for example, you would find that inscription that Tad showed us earlier, since that name is going to be directly transcribed into the observation record. Searching for different types of provenance evidence will also work here. So a simple search for inscriptions would return all of the records classified as either ownership inscriptions or presentation inscriptions, in addition to any records where the word inscriptions actually appears in the text of the evidence itself, since we are transcribing or describing the text in full, or in the title of a book that we've processed for the database, for example, or so on and so forth. Of course, you will also be able to limit your search to a specified field. So for example, you could search for all of the observations tagged as labels, that is classified according to our thesaurus as labels in our evidence type field. And it's worth noting that by default, both of these basic and advanced search options will lean heavily on the thesaurus authority file. So remember those 100+ non-preferred terms that I mentioned earlier? They are used behind the scenes to control for synonyms or other variant terminology. So for example, book labels, provenance labels, and stickers are all non-preferred terms in our thesaurus for labels. They all have entries in the thesaurus, and each of those non-preferred entries simply says use labels. So unless you check the little exact match box there, searching for any of those terms will also return records tagged as labels. The search algorithm translates input through the thesaurus behind the scenes. The structure of the thesaurus itself is also used to translate search input. And what I mean by this is that a search for labels will return not only the records classified as labels directly, but it will also recognize that labels is a valid term in the thesaurus, and it has several child terms. And before it returns any results, it will re-execute that search using those child terms as well. So for example, binders tickets, booksellers labels, book plates, all of that like we saw earlier. And that's because of the hierarchical nature of the thesaurus, right? All of the things that I just mentioned, all of the things that Tad showed us earlier are examples of labels. They're specific instances of a parent term. And our thesaurus classifications can become even more powerful when they're used in conjunction with other database fields. So again, using our advanced search, an experienced user should be able to turn complex queries into multi-field searches using things like Boolean operators, ranging, wildcards, and so on. If you were interested in seeing some of our 19th century armorial book plates, for example, but only those in books printed in the 18th century, you could do that. You can break it down into a single search across multiple different database fields, combining our thesaurus classifications with ranges for the date of publication and the approximate date of the observation. All of that's getting assigned in the database. So when is all of this going to be available? We are hoping to have the back-end part of the database completed later this year or early next year, which means that we could start porting over our older records. Remember that spreadsheet of records collected way back in 2014, 2015 that I mentioned, and then start doing some new data entry as well. And then we are hoping that the database will officially launch, at least in some form, sometime next year. Obviously, the pandemic has pushed back our timeline a little bit, so I don't want to make any promises. We're still dealing with some of the fallout from that, but things are moving in a good direction. The database will be small at first, but it will grow over time, and the usefulness of the data and of the thesaurus will grow with it. Our hope is that in a few years, our provenance database might be a model that other libraries will want to emulate. So thank you for listening to our story and for being with us here at this new beginning. We are happy to answer any questions you might have about the thesaurus or about the project in general. And this slideshow, in addition to the latest iteration of the thesaurus, I have also loaded onto my staff page if you want to follow any of these references or check anything else out. So thank you.
Thank you to both of you. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please add them to the chat. We did have one come in. Do you distinguish between handwritten signage or print or block signage in the thesaurus descriptions?
So I thank you for your question, Susie. So if I'm understanding this correct, like cursive versus print in the description?
Hi, Tad. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Handwriting versus like the stamped block.
Oh,
Because you gave the example where you had signage that was like the text block, but then you also have autographs and ownership. And I was wondering if you distinct between the two in your thesaurus.
So we don't directly, I mean, we don't directly make that distinction, at least not explicitly, but we do, there are ways of capturing that distinction. So we have some terms in the full thesaurus that describe, that are more content based, like, you know, the content of this text, whatever the form it might take, is a claim of ownership, right? Like, this is my book, or it's somebody's name and their address, and clearly the intent is, you know, to claim ownership. But then we also have terms that are more form based, right? Like, this is an ink stamp, or this is a, you know, whatever, a label or something. And so it is possible to combine, again, multiple terms for form, for content, to kind of arrive at some Frankenstein's monster that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So an autograph would be specifically for a handwritten name, but if you had something like you're describing that was stamped on or that was pasted on as an ownership label, we do have terms that can describe that, and it's possible you might have to just combine a couple of terms, like combine ink stamp with ownership inscription or something like that. And it's, again, it's the intersection of both of those, you know, right? Oh, it's an ownership inscription stamped in ink. Okay, what would that look like? So you can do that in a not in a direct way, but by assigning kind of different parts of what you're seeing. You can create new terms sort of from the ground up like that. We would do the same thing, by the way, in that example that Tad showed, where there's a name that's been crossed out, but then there's also a date, and the intent of the entire kind of block of that writing is to claim ownership, right? Like, that would get assigned ownership inscription, autograph, and date. It's kind of all of those things in one, because it was written all at once, and the intention was to, you know, claim ownership, but with a name and with a date as well. And that obliteration, that scratching out that was over the top, that would get a separate entry that would be connected. Those records would be connected, but that obliteration was added later for a different purpose. It's not really part of the original, it's just layered on top of it. So that would be like an example of two observations there, where one, the whole block of text is described in according to those terms, and then there's some additional, you know, some additional terms that would get added on.